Welcome to our Latino Studies Association webinar. Today, we are presenting three amazing political scientists and colleagues in Latino studies who are going to help us understand and rethink and think about why Latinos had such an important role in the election of Donald Trump now in November. I'm hoping that as many as just like I have been so totally in shock and in awe and confused by these electoral results, as many of us are. Hopefully, this webinar session will give us a better understanding of the nuances and the details and the analysis behind the Latino vote. I am Frances Aparicio, President of the Latino Studies Association, and I welcome you all to our fall webinar. We have three amazing colleagues who are going to be presenting. First, Professor Gary Segura from UCLA. He served as the Dean of the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA from 2017 through 2022. He also teaches political science and Chicano studies. His research focuses on issues of political representation and social cleavages, the domestic politics of wartime public opinion, and the politics of America's growing Latino minority. Professor Segura has published more than 55 articles and chapters, and he's a co-editor of a titled Diversity in Democracy, Minority Representation in the United States. He's also co-author of 4 books, Latino America, How America's Most Dynamic Population is Poised to Transform the Politics of the Nation. The second one, Latinos in the New Millennium, an Almanac of Opinion, Behavior, and Policy Preferences. The third, The Future is Ours, Minority Politics, Political Behavior, and the Multiracial Era of American Politics. And last, Latino Lives in America, Making It Home. Gary has been active in professional service. He has served on numerous committees and editorial boards, and he's a past president of the Western Political Science Association, Midwest Political Science Association, and the Latino Caucus in Political Science. From 2009 to 2015, he was the co-principal investigator of the American National Election Studies. Moreover, he has briefed members of Congress and senior administration officials on issues related to Latinos, served as an expert witness in 3 marriage equality cases heard by the Supreme Court, and he has filed amicus curiae briefs on subjects as diverse as voting rights, marriage equality, and affirmative action. I'm going to welcome Professor Segura. I'm going to move on to, I'm sorry, Gary. I'm going to move on to present Lisa Magaña and our third speaker, and then Gary will start. Lisa Magaña is Associate Dean of Strategic Charter Initiatives at Arizona State University, where she is professor at the School of Transborder Studies. She has published in the area of immigration and Latino public policy issues. She is the author of Stranding the Border and the Politics of Diversity in Arizona, Immigration and Latinos and Politics. She's also co-editor of the book Latino Politics and Arizona's Immigration Law, SB 1070. She has a new co-authored book with Cesar Silva entitled Empoderados, Empowered, How Latinos Transform Politics in Arizona from 2021. She has also published numerous chapters and book articles on immigration and Latino politics, and she has been interviewed in numerous media outlets. She's also president of the Chicano Latino Faculty and Staff Association at ASU from 2006 through 2007, and also has served as advisor to the Chicano Latino Faculty and Staff Association Executive Board. And our last presenter is Cristina Beltrán, who is a professor at NYU in social and cultural analysis. Her areas of research and interest include modern and contemporary political theory, democratic theory, Latinx studies, and Latinx politics in the US, African-American political thought, feminist and queer theory, American political thought, US conservative right-wing politics, race and ethnicity, aesthetics, and affect theory. You may know her first book, The Trouble with Unity, Latino Politics and the Creation of Identity, published by Oxford University Press 2010. This book was also published in Spanish, translated into Spanish by Casa de las Americas in Cuba. Her second book, Cruelty as Citizenship, How Migrant Suffering Sustains White Democracy, was published by University of Minnesota Press in 2020. She also has numerous articles, book chapters, and essays. Among her fellowships, honors, and awards, I just want to mention in 2013, 2014, she was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at the School of Social Science in Princeton, New Jersey. And in 2012, she received the Casa de las Americas Literary Prize for the best book in studies of Latinos in the United States. 2011, she was winner of the American Political Science Association's Ralph Bunche Award for the best book in political science on ethnic and cultural pluralism. And that same year, she also received the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association for the best book on racial and ethnic political identities, ideologies, and theories. I'm going to welcome Cristina as well. I want to remind the audience before we begin, each presenter will have about 15 minutes to speak, and then we will open it up for questions and answers for the last half hour of the webinar. Please feel free to include your questions or comments in the chat. And after the speakers are done, my colleagues Julie Minnick and Monica Gossin will manage the question and answer section. And also we ask that you mute your audios while the speakers are presenting. Well, welcome again, and thank you so much for being here. I'll pass it on to Gary.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I want to thank Francis and the team at the Latino Studies Association for having us here. And like many of you, I spent much of the last 4 weeks traumatized and taken aback by the unfortunate turn that has happened to the country. I'm going to share with you some data from the American Electorate Poll, and I'm going to share my screen now, so let's all keep our fingers crossed. Okay, hopefully everyone is seeing a slide. I am interested in understanding how voters vote. This is what I do. And this poll was conducted with almost 10,000 Americans from every racial and ethnic background, including very large oversamples of African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. What the exit polls often don't do is get valid samples, subsamples of minority populations. And so that's why we think we're in a position to offer maybe more accurate and also more informed judgment of how Latinos voted. So Latinos, we have 3,750 Latino interviews in this study, which is a margin of error of plus or minus 1.62%. We gathered an oversample of Puerto Rican voters, particularly after the garbage island comments the weekend, a week prior to the election. We fielded from October 18th to November 4th, collecting data as early votes and early in-person and mail-in votes were sent in, and we stopped interviewing the night before the election. The survey is available in English and Spanish according to respondent choices, and it was mixed mode. About 25% of the completes were on live telephone calls, about 75% online. People were only interviewed if they had already voted or if they were absolutely certain to vote. And when we validate, we find about a 92% match rate. So what were our key findings? The majority of Latino voters cast their ballots for Vice President Harris. Yes, Trump improved his standing among almost every subset of the electorate, Latinos included. But Trump only won one racial population in the United States, and that was white voters. Our estimate of Latino vote share and inter-election shift is smaller than the exit polls, and that's largely due to sampling methodology choices made by the exit polls, which do not gather a representative sample of communities of color. Latino voters were not instrumental in the Trump victory. If no Latino had cast a ballot, the outcome would be unchanged. This is true at the national level and likely in every battleground state. It is true, however, that had Latinos voted in ways similar to earlier elections, they might have prevented Trump from winning several states, though it's less clear that they would have changed the outcome overall. The dominant issues shaping Latino vote choices were pocketbook matters with inflation and jobs in the economy as the two most important issues, housing costs and healthcare costs coming in shortly after that. Social issues like abortion, Immigration policy for immigrants already here, and gun violence came next. We've heard a lot about the border, but it was the 8th most pressing concern among Latino voters. Latino voters support an immigration policy that pairs border enforcement with a path to citizenship for those who are already here. And they do not like mass deportations. So I want to help you understand the outcome, at least to the extent that I have the data to do so. And I don't know that I'll ever understand how we were able to get to this point in US history, but at least with respect to the voting a month ago. Again, Latino voters were not instrumental in the Trump victory. In past cycles, Latinos were able to offset white majorities, but turnout differentials in this election is somewhat of an untalked about story, which is former and future President Trump got about what he got 4 years ago, a little bit more, but there was a rather substantial decline in Democratic overall participation. So it's not that voters switched to Trump, it's that they did not show up all along. So if you want to try to blame Latinos for the outcome of the election, you would have to make some pretty heroic expectations of Latino vote. If we accepted the exit polls at face value, and I told you a moment ago I do not, it would have been exceedingly difficult for Latinos to alter the outcome. While historical voting patterns might have flipped Michigan and Nevada, further flips would have required things that would be at percentages we would find unexpected and exceptional. Now, what do the actual votes suggest? As I mentioned a moment ago, exit polls are less reliable for subpopulations, and this is the reason of sampling strategy, the clustering of their interviews, and the language interview. Very few interviews are conducted in Spanish in the national exit polls. Some of the exit poll estimates would have estimated inter-election swings that are just simply way beyond the beliefs of most political scientists. So to estimate their accuracy, BSP alone and in cooperation with several other organizations has been examining precinct level data using ecological regression and ecological inference to arrive at point estimates of actual votes recorded. Now, again, this is not another poll. This is the actual votes collected at actual precincts. And while we've just begun, there are several examples that show a pretty significant miss. Now, this chart shows you each precinct in Maricopa County, Arizona. And what you see here is the x-axis represents the share of each precinct represented by Latino voters, and the y-axis is the Democratic share of the vote in that precinct. And what you're going to see is that the dark blue line is President Biden's results in 2020, and the light blue line is Vice President Harris's results last month. That estimate suggests to us that about 74% of Latinos in Arizona voted Democratic. That is higher than our estimate in our poll and dramatically higher than the exit polls. But it does show an inter-election decline of about 5 points. The Latino electorate did move towards Trump, but not by the catastrophic margins that are suggested by the exit poll. This is Philadelphia County, and this is in Pennsylvania. Exit poll suggested that Vice President Harris only won 57% of the vote, but as you can see, the actual votes suggest otherwise. That blue line is a line fitted to precinct level results based on Latino population and actual votes counted. There are 6 precincts in this county that are over 80% Latino, and they hover at around 75% Harris. Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, you see more of a slope here. You've got a much more diverse electorate in terms of politics in Lehigh County than you do in Philadelphia, which is a fairly Democratic city. Nevertheless, our estimate would be that Latinos went over 60% for Harris in Lehigh County. Now, those results are just a smattering. We're still working on Harris County, Texas, and a few other places of interest, Clark County, Nevada, and so forth. But the idea there is that actual votes are inconsistent with the estimates of the exit polls. So while we're all a little disappointed with the results from Latinos, don't be too hard on us just yet. So here's the results from our poll. When we asked people what the most important issues were, they were allowed to name up the 3 issues. And as you can see, cost of living inflation, jobs in the economy, housing costs, and healthcare costs were the top 4. This was very much a bread and butter election. Most voters believe that the Democrats would be better able to address their most important concern. You could see about a 7-point gender gap there between men and women. And you can also see that the Latino national confidence in the Democrats is lower than their vote for Harris, because there's the both and neither categories, which sum up to a fair amount of the vote. People who are really either equally trusting of both parties or distrusting of both parties. Young voters, and of course Cuban voters, which is not new, were the real holdouts in terms of trusting Democrats to handle their issues over Republicans. When we asked a question that we've been asking for about a decade now, do you think the party cares a great deal about your community, doesn't care too much, or is actively hostile? You can see that a majority of our respondents believe the Democrats care a great deal, but a big section of the respondents think Democrats don't care too much. A very small number of people think the Democrats are hostile to Latinos. If you go to the Republican side, about a third of Latinos thought that the Republican Party cared about them. A plurality felt they didn't care too much. And a strong, maybe as 25 to 30%, felt that the Republicans were actively hostile to their interests. A large majority of Latinos voted to protect abortion on the state ballots where we had sufficient sample to estimate that. Our estimate was 81% in Nevada, 63% in Florida, and 79% in Arizona voted for the statewide measures that would have protected abortion rights. Florida, as you know, failed because it got a majority, but it didn't get a 60% threshold, which is required by that state. In terms of House vote, we have the generic House ballot as 62-34 in favor of the Democrats, and you can see it varies a bit by states. Only Florida was where the Republicans got the best of Democrats. The same is true in Senate vote. The Florida Senate vote tilted towards Senator Scott, but in every other instance, the Democratic candidate won a majority, and in Arizona and Pennsylvania, a strong majority of Latino votes. And then here's our presidential vote estimate. We had it at 62-37. The exit polls have something closer to 56-43. We are very, very certain that they are incorrect, and it's because of their sampling strategy. I wanted to point this out after the Garbage Island comments. Puerto Rican voters were overall more supportive of Harris than Latinos in general, and certainly way more supportive than Latinos in Florida, with 57% for Harris compared to 43%. And then in Pennsylvania, where there was a huge investment late in the game, it was about a 1 percentage point difference. So we did do this really interesting experiment because we were already interviewing when the unfortunate Madison Square Garden comments took place. We can compare Pennsylvania Latinos, which, as you know, is a very heavily Puerto Rican population, the Pennsylvania Latinos pre-Madison Square Garden versus post-Madison Square Garden, and we see a 9-point difference in the share going for Vice President Harris. So she was plus 31 pre-Madison Square Garden and plus 47 after, because her share of the two-party vote went from 64, which is kind of what it was everywhere else, to 73, which is very, very high. If you look at sort of the national vote for Harris, it varies a lot by place. Obviously, Republicans voted overwhelmingly for President Trump. The Cubans, again, a small majority, 9 percentage points for President Trump. Men 18 to 39. If you want to worry about a number, worry about this one. Latino men 18 to 39 were plus 3.6, or we have it plus 4, but it looks like it's plus 3 on the dots. It's because of rounding error. That was a very, very close place. Everywhere else, of course, it gets bigger. But again, young voters were a problem, young males rather, were a problem for the vice president. We did ask an interesting set of questions about gender. We asked a question for Harris voters. Was it the main reason you voted for Harris? Was it a contributory reason you voted for Harris, or did it have no effect? And then we asked Trump voters, was it a reason for you not to vote for Harris? Was it a contributing reason not to vote for Harris, or did it have no effect? Then we combine those two numbers. And what you're going to see is that about 39% of the voters said that they favored or it contributed to their support of the vice president, compared to 15% saying it contributed to their opposition and 46% saying no effect. And as you can see, there is a gender difference on that, which is exactly the gender difference you would have otherwise expected. Okay, the Latino electorate in this election, just like many others, is brand new, a lot of new voters. Our estimate is that 36% of the voters who cast ballots in 2024 are new since Hillary and Trump faced off in 2016. So some of them voted in 2020 for the first time, some voted for 2024 for the first time, which is why both political parties need to get a grip and understanding that outreach to Latinos has to be ongoing. Because if it's not ongoing, you've got all these new voters in every year that have never really heard your outreach. By wide margins, Latinos supported a proposal that combined border security with a pathway to citizenship over one that combined border security with mass deportations. There's some variation in the states, but you could see nationally it was 70, basically 3/4 to 1/4. Latinos overwhelming, including, by the way, Latino Republicans and all Republicans, and indeed a majority of whites, blacks, and Asians, supported a path to citizenship for Dreamers. They supported family reunification enhancement. They supported the president using an executive order if Congress wouldn't. And they supported the bipartisan bill that the Trump campaign scotched in the months prior to the election. A majority of Latino voters think that abortion should be legal. So about 86, 87% either personally support a woman's right to abortion or are personally uncomfortable with it, but don't believe the law should be used to take away those rights. That includes almost 90% of independents and almost 70% of Republicans. Supermajorities of Latino voters really favor progressive policy changes. 90% want a law against price gouging. 90% want a new Voting Rights Act. 90% wanted better clean energy investment. 86% want the rich and corporations to pay more. 80% want to build new homes and give down payment support to families. 79% want a law guaranteeing access to abortion. In terms of what worries people, only Trump voters were really worried about inflation as the bigger concern than all other concerns. People who are thinking about democracy, immigration raids, and abortion favored the vice president over President Trump. And that's the results I'll share with you today. There's some details in there, and I am going to send a PDF version of these slides to Francis after the fact, so that if you guys want that, you'll be able to get it. And I'm going to end my share. These are all the various organizations that supported the poll. I'm going to end my share and turn it over to Lisa Magaña.
Hi there, greetings. Thank you for this opportunity. I feel really grateful to be with such esteemed colleagues and this really wonderful event. So thank you for the invitation. I'm glad Gary went through all the numbers because I knew he would do a better job than I could ever do. So thank you, Gary. So let me talk a little bit about, so my name's Lisa Magaña. I'm here in Arizona. And I want to highlight some of the stuff that Gary went through, but perhaps give a little bit of nuance here in Arizona. So yes, we know that that Latinos are not monolithic. We can say that in Arizona that that I agree with Gary was 60, high 30s, maybe 40, some of the polling. I think 63, 36 is what Gary had in Arizona. prior to the election, I saw that 90% of all Latinos were going to turn out for the election. That didn't obviously happen. But I want to talk about voter turnout in Arizona, and I want to focus on Maricopa County. And so for those of you that don't know, most people in the state of Arizona live in Maricopa County, which is the Phoenix area and surrounding cities. So it's something like there's almost 7 million people in Arizona and about 4 million here in the Maricopa County. So what happens here is essentially what happens in the state. And I want to remind folks that during the last election, Arizona voted for Biden by only 10,000 votes. That was it. And the 10,000 votes were here in Maricopa County. So, you know, it was close. I was not too surprised. But again, you're right, Gary, that the polling overestimated turnout and certainly how folks were going to turn out and vote. And so let me just go a little bit through this last election and some of the sort of the interesting outcomes. So yes, I would say that 60% went for Harris, and those of course are Mexican nationals, predominantly here in Arizona. Obviously, there's Puerto Rican as well, and actually a growing Cuban American population. That's really interesting in terms of migration here to the state of Arizona. So in this last election, we had several different initiatives that the turnout seemed a little counterintuitive. So first, we had the first Latino senator that was elected here in Arizona, Ruben Gallego, and he ran against this woman named Carrie Lake, who was basically the female Donald Trump, and essentially had all the same agenda, very much aligned with Trump, was endorsed by Trump, but she just couldn't get the votes from actually Republicans as well, pretty close, but it just this idea, these Trump proposals didn't necessarily work statewide like we would assume. And so that's a really interesting thing we want to think about. And the second part is that we overwhelmingly, Latinos as well, overwhelmingly was in support of this abortion initiative, making abortion safe in Arizona, which was a little counterintuitive, if you're thinking Latinos, Catholic, or would be opposing this, but overwhelmingly passed this particular legislation in support of abortion and access to abortion. Again, counterintuitive. And then in the same election, Arizonans, and these are again are Latinos, overwhelmingly supported what was called Senate Bill 314. And this Senate bill was essentially, for those of you that aren't aware, there in 2010, a very tough draconian law called SB 1070, which was the Show Me Your Papers law, that basically anybody could be stopped and detained by a police officer in Arizona if the police officer thought that the person was unlawfully in the state of Arizona. Basically, it's called driving while brown. And this was passed overwhelmingly. And I want to talk a little bit why this was so interesting. And a couple things. In the law, it has all the same legislation as SB 1070. However, during SB 1070, it's important to note that people in Arizona never got to vote on it. It was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. So this is interesting in that this particular proposition, people in Arizona were able to vote on it. But the important distinction, and we need to think about this, is in this law, it says that, of course, fentanyl is bad and we should have very strict laws to penalize those that sell fentanyl. That makes sense. And so I think that was one of at least the polling shows that was one of the reasons why this SB 314 was passed, this idea of fentanyl. And so why Latinos would support it. And Gary had talked about the polling, and that these ideas of immigration aren't necessarily top concerns for Latinos. I agree that it was the economy, or how much can you buy a house in Arizona? These sort of economic issues, I think, are more salient than immigration. But I think really important here was that that provision of fentanyl, I think, is one of the reasons why this SB 314 passed. Now I'm going to add a little bit that in the last 3 elections, and I'm going to name drop here if I may, but I've taught a course the last 2 years with the Secretary of State of Arizona, Adrian Fontes, who is one of the first prominent elected Latinos in Arizona. So it's the governor, and then he's second in charge. And we teach a Latino politics course together. And we have both sort of come to the consensus, at least in Maricopa County, that I would say that partisanship has actually changed a lot in this particular county. And let me go through why. And in Arizona, it's shifted in terms of partisanship. So this state was predominantly Republican, super Republican. And in the last, I would say 20 years, because of migration from other states, a growing, changing demographic, an aging population, that Maricopa County has shifted demographically, but also shifted in terms of partisanship. So what we have now, and you're seeing this in the last 3 elections, excuse me, because it'd be the midterms and then the previous presidential election, is that you have Republicans, and then you have Democrats, and then you have independents. And we're seeing that these independents are essentially moderate Republicans, where Trump is just too much. And that if you can vote as an independent, you're able to pick a different candidate, or maybe what we saw, people that maybe didn't vote for Trump, but voted for other candidates down ballot, or propositions that you would assume are Republican. And this has been consistent, very much so. And so I think that's been why some of the, for example, Latino candidates have been very successful here, is that they've been more moderate. They've been able to appease, say, folks that would only vote for Republicans were able to not vote for a Carrie Lake, but maybe vote for a Ruben Gallego, because, again, some of the sort of the agendas in the Trump or the Republican base was just too much. And that is consistent. And so I'm not surprised, again, by the polling, but this has been, again, that it has not been so much partisan, at least in Maricopa County. And I want to go back to this idea of immigration politics. And I want to say that, so we've done some recent polling about SB 314. And I just thought this was really interesting to share this. They recently did an interview with some elected officials who were very much in support of SB 1070. This is the one in 2010. And this, again, 314 is SB 1070 all over again. And they interviewed some of the folks that passed this, and talking and comparing it to now, this 314 provision. And it's really interesting because they've come out saying a couple things. One is that immigration has gone down since 2010. Actually, it was down before 2010. It was down during 2007 and 2008 because of the economic recession, but then we passed 2010 as a way to sort of say this is why the economy was so bad. However, elected officials have said, yes, we know that immigration has gone down, but essentially that immigration reforms or agendas are really good for the Republican Party. We're really good at this, and we're really good at marketing this. And so we could say, so here's a good example. When there was the bipartisan proposal to do something about immigration this last year, Donald Trump said, we cannot let Biden have this victory. We cannot. We have to keep immigration at the forefront as something that we need to do, or make it a big issue. And so I'm not surprised with the polling that Gary did that, for example, for Latinos, immigration was not a #1 issue, but for those that did, in fact, support Trump or Republicans, that immigration was, in fact, a big issue. And so I really want to emphasize that this sort of idea that Republicans are better at making this an issue rather than Democrats is something that maybe we need to be thinking about in terms of targeting or creating as an agenda. So I agree that the survey data on DACA is very much in support. But again, it goes back and forth in terms of support or popular or it's not so popular. But this is something that we should think about. The other thing that I would say, at least in Arizona, that in the past, that when Arizona Republicans have been certainly tough on immigration, it has actually been counterintuitive. And so we saw, going back to 2010, that when SB 1070 was passed, a very draconian law, it actually served to galvanize Latinos. And so we saw that first time, folks registered to vote saying, I want to vote for the first time to oppose these really, these folks that are tough on immigration and do something about immigration. And this is actually, we've seen in the last 3 elections, folks that were galvanized or mobilized as a result to oppose these draconian policies. We're now seeing them very much participating in the political process. And so I would say here in Arizona, particularly in the Maricopa County, we've actually seen, and we can go through the numbers, that the voter turnout for Latino political participation has gone up. However, we do know that there wasn't everybody that went and voted, but overall, Latino political participation has gone up. And we know that it's short-sighted to, so the more tougher that folks are at immigration, it only serves to galvanize the population. So it's kind of short-sighted. Yes, it's good in the short run to get votes to look like you're tough on immigration, but in the long run, it doesn't serve to play out. And then the next thing that I would say is that excuse me, that when we talk about Latinos, that, so for example, I think, Gary, you had 27%, which I agree. It's like 33% of the state are Latino demographically, but of course not everyone can vote or as of an age. But something you want to think about is in terms of generation. And so it's something like 2/3 have been here. 90% are US citizens in Arizona and have been here numerous generations. And so when you're comparing how Latinos vote, they're going to vote just like somebody else who's lived in Arizona or their family has lived generations in Arizona. So it's that changing demographic that we need to think about in terms of generational status here that has shifted in terms of they're getting older, but there's certainly groups that have a lot of potential in terms of political voter participation. And then I would say, I would just add to this as well, is that it's really interesting being here in Arizona and particularly Maricopa County, and we talk about Latino politics. And I would say, oh, by the way, just a little footnote, when I talk to, or when I teach this course with the Secretary of State, he will say that he didn't run as a Latino candidate. He ran as a candidate. And what do we think about, and what are those traits that we need to be putting out there that are Latino? And I would just say quickly that the commercials here were, I thought, amazing, targeting Harris, because we've all seen the Hispandering commercials that are terrible, right? I go and I do they're terrible when they're trying to pander to the Latino population. I thought that the Harris campaign did an excellent job. Rather than focusing on a particular group, she talked about her immigrant background and why being a first generation and going to school and hardworking. I thought that was an incredibly powerful message that I thought was a better message to Latinos than particularly Hispanic or appeasing to a particular group. And so I would just add, say my time here, I would just add that Latino politics here in Arizona is very interesting. And I'm here at a university, yes, but we have youth that are immigrant activists that cannot vote. And in the last, I don't know, last 20 years, I've seen very much immigrant activists that cannot vote that work with the Democratic Party in terms of political outreach. And so, for example, I've had students that'll go and canvass with folks and say, listen, I can't vote, but can you vote and support somebody that believes in comprehensive immigration? And we have seen there's incredible organizations here that work with these immigrant activists in ways of having them politically engaged, not necessarily just voting. Ultimately, that's great. But there are various different ways that Latino politics is played out. And just one last example, after SB 1070, there was an organization out of the Biden administration called One Arizona, which is super powerful. And it's an umbrella organization that helps to set up some funding, but helps to work with grassroots organizations to get, one last term, what we call the new American electorate. And so I would say here in Maricopa County, at least, and in Arizona, that we don't just think about targeting, Latino voters, but thinking about new voters, people that have never been part of the political process, who've never been included in discussions about, have you ever registered to vote? We've had people say no, because nobody's ever asked me to register to vote. And so getting brand new women, folks that have just newly registered, again, folks that have never been part of the political process. This is what we're doing here in Arizona called the New American Electorate, particularly in Maricopa County. All right, so I'm going to stay on my time, and I look forward to any of your questions. But let me just reiterate that it's a very dynamic space here in Arizona when it comes to Latino politics.
Hi. So thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Gary, and thank you, Francis Aparicio, for organizing this and for inviting us all here to speak today. I'm really interested in having this conversation with everybody, so I'll try to be pretty brief here as well, but I'm excited to have this conversation. So as I said before, I'm Cristina Beltrán, and I approach this election in a somewhat different orientation. I approach it as a political theorist who's written on Latinx, Latino political identities, and I've always approached Latinx identities and communities with a certain kind of post-structuralist approach, which is with the presumption that there is no pre-existing collective political consciousness among this very diverse population. In other words, that Latinidad is a politically uncertain practice, right? That it can be invoked to consolidate forms of corporate power, and it can also be critical to resistance and progressive movements of social change. So I'm going to be talking about this on kind of a different register that I think will sort of dovetail with the conversation we've already had, and maybe push out to some other questions that we still are trying to figure out, or I'm trying to figure out. So on the one hand, while I think this election was enormously disheartening, it also sort of confirms something I've thought about for a long time, which is that political identities are forged rather than pre-existing, right? That there's a difference between a political identity and a cultural identity, that they overlap, but that they're not the same thing. And I think that idea that these are political identities are not the same as cultural identities, this is a central insight within Latino studies, and it reflects a lot of work in our field. And I'm sure a lot of folks who are out there here today, but certainly work like Francis's work by Arlene Davila, et cetera. Other folks have sort of walked us through the data. I guess one of my main suggestions is that for us as scholars and as teachers is to figure out how to explore some of these real political shifts that have occurred without letting bad political punditry suck us in. American political punditry always wants to tell simplistic stories about Latinos, as if Latinos are one thing. And so there's this, we all have experienced this, we've all taught about this, I think, the ongoing tendency to sort of at the beginning to name all the diversity, but then immediately start talking about the Latino community or the Latino vote as if there is one electorate or one community, rather than, as Lisa was saying, that there's so much dynamism involved here. And so I think in terms of bad punditry, I think the current narrative is that Latinos have become conservative, that the group has shifted right, particularly Latino men. Now, we are seeing real shifts that we need to more fully understand that Gary was also sort of walking us through. But again, I think it's this tendency to speak as if before, in the past, Latinos were like Obama Democrats, and now they're MAGA Republicans. So I just want to emphasize what I think is really important for us to keep in mind in this political moment, in all moments, but maybe now particularly, and that is the importance of thinking about simultaneity. That when it comes to seeing millions of people participate, we can see lots of things happening in large numbers. And we have to be able to talk about Latino political behavior in all its complexity, right? Because it's multiple stories of a huge population that is diverse on many levels, right? And so personally, that's one reason why I would like to stop talking about the Latino vote altogether. There is no Latino vote. There are Latino voters, and we need to understand the many ways they identify politically and what material, social, cultural forces shape how they identify politically. And that those forces are going to look familiar at times, but those forces are also going to surprise us. And I think we have to be open to being surprised and not simply slot new and emergent identities into our own familiar ways of thinking, or also our own desires for what we wish Latinos were politically, right? So that we don't embrace practices, we support and then deny or dismiss the political actions and beliefs that we wish didn't exist, right? Or the risk that we also reduce Latinos to one negative quality in our communities, right? That we only emphasize sexism or machismo or anti-Blackness or the desire for whiteness. Again, those dynamics are at play, right? There is anti-Blackness, there is sexism, there is a desire for whiteness. There always has been, but there's also always, there are queer practices of resistance. There's Afro-Latinidad and practices of Blackness in our communities. There's feminism. There's radical migrant imaginaries, right? There's also conservative and carceral Latinx imaginaries as well. So I think, sort of balancing both the histories we know with thinking about the emergent and the new, and taking both seriously is something I think, we need to do in this moment, and seems really important. I'll note just a few things I think are particularly worth considering. I think one question that Francis posed to us was immigration and securing the border an important issue for the Latinx vote? And I think we can see from the conversation already that the answer is complicated, right? It is important, but perhaps it's important in unexpected ways. One way it's important, I think, that we have to think about is that the past quarter century we've seen in the past 25 years, or roughly 23 years, the accelerated growth of what Alfonso Gonzalez and others have called the Homeland Security State, right? The growth of the Homeland Security State since 9/11, right? Decades of endless war in Iraq and Afghanistan that only ended recently, the ongoing militarization and hardening of borders, and the massive growth of the detention and deportation machine in this country. Latino Studies has done really powerful work exploring the violence these policies have had on Latinos and on our communities. But I think what we've looked at less is how Latinos are also staffing this massive Homeland Security state, right? We have also served as veterans in these endless wars, right? We have generations now of veterans. And these institutions, right, working for the Border Patrol, working for police, working in security guards, right? These different participating in, carceral institutions are also a form of civic education, right? They offer a view of the world, right? If you work for the Border Patrol, you're getting a view about the meaning of borders. You're getting a story about illegality. Same thing with decades of massive prison growth or the growth of policing. I am always struck by the fact that here in New York City, when I go into the subways and when I see the police are disproportionately Black and brown today. And And that's true of security guards and other spaces. So I think that we have to think really hard and deeply about the rise and the depth now of decades of what some have called the carceral welfare state, right? That there are so many jobs now that offer, particularly Latino men, jobs with, with security, a union, pensions, and how so many of them are embedded in the politics of violence and carcerality, right? That often involve, doing punitive or policing actions on other members of these same communities, of poor communities, right? And that it's also a place that helps people move into a new economic side of middle classness, being able to buy a home, retire, et cetera. So I just think that's something, we have to keep in mind. I think another issue that this election has really brought to bear that other folks have raised is the question of generational shifts, right? So many new voters. But also, I think thinking about these generational shifts, thinking about the fact that Latinos have very high rates of intermarriage, thinking about, so I think when we talk about, again, Latino voters, instead of the Latino vote, when we talk about Latino voters, we have to think about the age of Latino voters. We have to think about how they identify in terms of what parts of their identity are mobilizing them, right? If you only have one parent who's Latino and the other parent is white, you may not have access to language any longer in the same ways. And depending on the neighborhood you live in, what being Latino means to different Latino voters, I think is a really interesting question. And if other issues, whether or not they have a connection to immigrant communities at all, some of whom do, and some of whom do not. I also think that this isn't a unidirectional story. This is not just a story that like fourth generation will be less invested than first generation. Some of the research in Latino politics is showing that immigrants themselves might be more conservative politically than we might expect, right? Fourth generation Latino voters might become more politicized by going to college or other things. So I think we're going to have to think about racial identification but how it's shifting over generations and over time, and how racial identities are shifting as people are becoming themselves more multiracial, and sort of who they feel in solidarity with is going to have a lot to do with the result of these many diverse forces. I think we see that in our classrooms. We see that in our families. I've always said, I think it's never a question of whether or not Latinos, some people always asking, are Latinos going to become more like white ethnics, the kind of ALBA story, right? They're going to become white, or are they going to become racialized non-white populations and maintain that? Clearly, both are happening, right? We have Latinos who are increasingly identifying in ways that kind of echo the way white ethnics have identified over time. We're also seeing other segments of our communities identifying in as racialized, right, as non-white. They experience the world as non-white, but both of those things are happening, and we're going to have to sort of keep, I think, theorizing that in terms of how that affects how they vote, how they identify, the neighborhoods they live in, the kind of work they do, et cetera. I think the question of the college, non-college educated divide, which is becoming increasingly important, I think that's something we have to keep thinking more and more about, especially because so many Latinos, we still have these disproportionate numbers of people not getting a four-year degree. And so what does that politics of education, what is that having on working class Latino voters, especially working class young Latino voters who are finding it increasingly difficult to buy a house? Inflation really slammed these communities. And so many of the concerns that they face are similar to the concerns that pulled a lot of white working class voters towards Trump and the GOP. I think we also need to think more about the social media ecosystem where voters are getting their information, especially younger Latino voters, and the question of how do we reach these potential voters, right? How do we keep turning non-voters into voters? And I take, Gary's point really seriously, the ongoing work that takes, the investment that takes, but also helping these new voters have access to good, reliable information, right? I think misinformation is a real issue. But I think it's also important that we don't think of misinformation just in terms of that Latinos who voted for Trump are not, whether we like it or not, they're not just being duped, right? They have feelings and opinions that we have to make sense of, and they found some of these arguments more compelling. And so I think one thing we have to think about is why liberal and progressive claims at times were less persuasive to some Latino voters in this election cycle. I guess one thing I'd like to just finish with is I think we're already sort of starting to see the start of the kind of Democratic Party blame game with liberals and moderates attacking progressives and the left for Harris's defeat, while the left blames, Biden and Harris's sort of pivot towards maybe more moderate politics or Biden's support of Israel, America's participation in the genocide in Gaza. I think all of these things obviously do play a role. But I think the easy part is saying how the segment of the coalition you don't like, it's easy to talk about how they are bad politically, right? If you're a progressive, it's easy to attack the moderates or the conservative Democrats. If you're a conservative, it's easy to go after the left. I think that's the easy part because it confirms what we already believe, which is always comforting, right? I think the harder part, and I think this is something we have to do, I hope, is to think about the segments of the coalition we are a part of and to think harder about our own failures to persuade. I think there are lessons for every segment of the Democratic coalition to learn from right now. So I want to just finish with a couple of thoughts about that. I think voters in 2024 were reacting to their frustration in some ways, and I think about this as a Democratic theorist, I think their frustration about the deep brokenness of our politics, how difficult it is to get anything done, right? For those of us who live in blue states, the struggle blue states have in building anything and building access to housing, right? Getting anything built, the kind of over regulations that we have to think about that make it very, very difficult for anything to happen. We have to think about the neoliberal gutting of the safety net by Democrats like Bill Clinton, right? The deregulation of banking, NAFTA, all the ways that Democratic moderates, DLC Democrats, supercharged wealth inequality, right? The role that things like the Monica Lewinsky scandal and Clinton lying to Americans and lowering the bar for presidential decency and making Americans more cynical about the quality and character of our leaders, right? That's happened in the last few decades, right? Then George W. Bush and the lies and the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan and more tax cuts and more supercharged inequality and the banking crisis. And then the promise of Obama, but also the Obama's administration's detention and deportation politics and Obama's own neoliberal capitulations and, alongside GOP obstructionism to the positive things Obama was trying to do and the white supremacy aimed at the first Black president, right? Of course, all of these things matter. And I think all of these things have to do with why lots of voters, especially new young voters, think the system is broken, think elites suck, and have failed them and have lied to them. And so I just think that's something we have to think about. I think any future Democratic presidential candidate who wants to win is going to have to speak credibly to all the betrayal and brokenness in order to sound credible to a majority of voters. And I think one of Trump's sort of superpowers is his relentless willingness to sort of say how everything is bad and it's stupid, but there's a way in which he names brokenness and seems like a disruptive figure. And that attracts people who feel like everything is broken and it turns them towards a kind of nihilistic politics. So I think for Democrats, we cannot just rely on the language of protecting institutions or maintaining political norms. I think those things matter a lot. But I think until the brokenness of our current politics is acknowledged, I don't think we can speak credibly to an electorate who has lived through so much government and governmental dysfunction. I think we need candidates who can name this and who also were not part of, being the architects of a lot of that brokenness. And I think this isn't just liberals. I'll just finish with this. I think we on progressives and the left, I think we need to do some real soul searching about how we organize and our own weaknesses in terms of how we sometimes frame issues. And we need to think about new ways about the legacy of radical politics and the good legacies of that, but how certain choices may not have always served us well then or now. I think those kinds of conversations are hard for a lot of us because we look at those, those pasts and we look at what they did successfully, but I think we also might need to look at what doesn't work. I think it's harder to talk openly about things that the left does that maybe are politically unproductive, that are unpersuasive to people who don't already agree with us. So I think of having hard conversations about our own abilities to persuade, and thinking maybe about some of the organizations and nonprofits that claim to represent our communities, but perhaps represent elite interests or ideologically invested segments of our communities rather than what mass-based sentiment on the ground actually is at times. I think we have to think about those things. And I guess my final point then is just that while all of us do research and teach in Latino studies, we're going to have to be open to considering new political formations within our communities that we haven't anticipated. And we need to more fully wrestle with the fact that Latino subjects, like their white counterparts, can also be drawn toward a politics of demonization and domination. As Gary noted, it looks like the majority of Latino voters don't support mass deportations, but some do. Some do support mass deportation, and we have to contend with that and think about how that happened and how we got here. At the same time, I think for those of us who are committed to migrant justice, to trans and LGBTQ plus communities, we are also going to have to think about how we organize in our communities around fighting mass deportation that we know are coming and protecting our students and our colleagues and our communities at a time when the university is also under attack. And I think that's part of the story. So I'll just end there, and excited to have this conversation. Thanks.
I'm going to invite the panelists now to turn on cameras, and I will move us all to a gallery view. And I will invite the attendees at this moment to type your questions. I'm not sure if you have the chat function or the Q&A function, but you can type your questions into either place. And Monica Gosen and I will be moderating the conversation. And there's a question to start us off while people are taking time to type. So this question comes from Frances Aparicio, and any of the panelists can answer it. She asks, any suggestions for how to talk to family members and friends who voted for Trump? How do we engage with them without demonizing them?
Well, I'll speak personally. I have family members that voted for Trump that are evangelical Christians, and that was certainly an issue for them. And, you know, I can't demonize them because they have very deep beliefs about particular issues. I will say it doesn't necessarily come up. But that was certainly one of the reasons my Latino family members, they don't like what he says, they don't like how he acts, but he's good on this one particular issue.
Yeah, I would just jump in and agree. I have some family members, and I think it's, you know, I did more canvassing in Pennsylvania for this election than I've ever done. And it actually made me feel better doing it, because one thing I really noticed, and I see this in my own family as well, is I have like one MAGA cousin. He's like all over. We are not going to have a conversation about this. His politics on this, or he's kind of gone down a QAnon, you know, he's in a different kind of political space right now. But I have other family members, and this was sort of what I experienced canvassing, other people who listen to different kinds of media, listen to different kinds of social media, are really angry about prices in California, angry that they can't even imagine buying a home in California. They were frustrated on a lot of different levels, and I don't think they were, you know, Trump became a vehicle to express their frustration, but they are people who I think have a lot of different kinds of feelings about politics. And so I'm trying to figure out how to just kind of talk to them and ask them more questions about what they're thinking. And so rather than just start debating them right away, I really want to start trying to listen to what is making them feel like things are so broken, and trying to kind of hear what, how they got where they got. And I think kind of trying to listen to each other and talk that through is really important right now, because I think they could be pulled into a different political formation. I don't think just because they voted for him this time means they're permanent conservative voters. I don't think that at all. And I felt that a lot in Pennsylvania. There were people voting this time, and they feel like they could be hailed into a lot of different formations. And so I think just figuring out how to listen to people, and not try to jump into the argument with them is something that I struggle with, but I'm going to be trying to do when I go back home for the holidays as well.
I will ask the next question that's in the Q&A. So this person is saying thank you so much for the panel. And they are quite curious if there are methods or approaches that can help us learn more about Latino voters that did not turn out and why they may not have turned out.
So I'll address that at least to start. So just for clarification and full disclosure, BSP worked for Vice President Harris, though I was not on the campaign because of Federal Election Commission rules. We had to divide ourselves. So we worked for both Vice President Harris and Future Forward. That was the part I worked, which was her super PAC. And we conducted a lot of focus groups. And in the focus groups, we had a lot of people who were planning to sit the election out and a lot of people who were undecided, even late into October. And political science makes it very clear that people who are undecided late in a cycle frequently just don't vote. And most of what was going on, and this is echoing what Cristina mentioned a moment ago, most of what was going on among men was this sense that nothing was better for them. And the vice president's campaign, I think, realized that late in the cycle and started investing in Black men and brown men, but it was probably too late. But that the economy overall is performing well and that the 401ks are reaching record highs doesn't mean anything to you if you don't have a 401k, which the vast majority of our population doesn't. And the same is true when we think about things like the cost of housing and real estate loans, mortgage rates. So simultaneously, prices got very high, eating into people's savings, and mortgage rates became unsustainable for the vast majority of Latino potential home buyers. So if you're a Latina, and there's still, for a variety of reasons, some traditional gender roles in Latino families, and these Latino men think it's on them to provide a house, and they can't. And they're mad as hell about that. Now, we might think that there's lots of people to blame, and it's probably not the incumbent administration, and that might be true, but that doesn't mean they know it's true. So the Democrats have done a very bad job of selling their policies. Even early in the cycle before the president dropped out, it was very clear to us that the vast majority of voters had no idea what the Inflation Reduction Act did, had no idea what the bipartisan infrastructure bill did, even though it put lots of jobs and lots of dollars into the pockets of Latino workers. They didn't know that. That's just bad communication. And the last thing I'll say is we don't have to persuade on issues. When you go down the list, we have the majority of Latino voters, male and female, with us on issues. They're just not attaching those issue positions to politicians. And in part, that's because the party has failed to deliver for them. 4 years ago, my guess is most Latino voters would have wanted immigration reform and an increased minimum wage as the two most important outcomes, and they got neither of them for the last 4 years.
So there's a question here that actually your answer has kind of previewed in a way, but you might want to elaborate on it, or any of the other panelists might want to speak to it. Someone is asking, an anonymous attendee is asking, how much of a role did disappointment with the inability of Democrats to advance immigration reform do you think play in the election? In other words, did they move on to other priorities?
I think it's exactly what Gary said, that it's not particularly an issue that we have the Latino constituents. Like I mentioned in Arizona, I think of course we want to punish people that sell fentanyl. Of course we want to do that. I don't think it was yes, it's an immigration, but I think that it's more the fentanyl thing, or the commercials, I should add here in Arizona, were the criminal alien that was deported that came back and killed some beautiful, innocent young woman. That was what was on. That was constantly the Trump message, that's what they were going to do about immigration. So I don't think it was the Latinos that necessarily supported, but it's those that support these types of immigration reforms that voted for it. So I respectfully, I don't think they were disappointed. I don't think that was a major issue. I agree completely with Gary that it was the economy, and a big deal here is being able to purchase a house. That is a very, very big deal here in Maricopa County.
Yeah, and I would just, I think the one of the things we have to really try to think about is that a lot of people have been saying we haven't really wrestled with COVID in a lot of ways, and the after effects of that, like the emotional ones, the disconnections, the various rabbit holes of online social media people have fallen into, like a lot of cultural shifts that I think we haven't really contended with. But I think one of the things that people have seen a lot of that I think people are struggling with is they've seen a lot more chaos in the streets. I mean, in New York, when they started busing migrants to New York City, and they started busing, that all of a sudden there had been like an imaginary migrant crisis, and then there was like more of an embodied real migrant crisis. And people were seeing people on the subways, and they were seeing, the kind of the chaos of a broken immigration system, and the way that they could then attach that brokenness to the people rather than to the failure of policy, right? And so I think same with homelessness, right? Like people don't like seeing chaos on the streets. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes them anxious. They want something to be done about it. And when they don't think there's something done about it, I think it makes people sometimes more open to draconian statements, because that sounds like, I think they don't fully interpret it as like the actual violence it's going to entail. They take it as a kind of rhetorical, that person's going to really do something about it. And that sounds like an action. And so I do think that for Democrats to think about the kind of, you can't keep telling people when life feels more chaotic on the streets that that's not real. Like you have to kind of find a way to talk about it and deal with it. And I think that's been a struggle in a lot of places like Portland or wherever, a lot of my family in the Bay Area, it's an ongoing struggle. And so I think it is something that the immigration question and the failure, not only was it a failure of policy, but it's a failure that people were kind of experiencing in their daily lives in ways that made voters in particular anxious and uncomfortable, I think sometimes.
Another question here has to do with some of the things you raised, that, these perceptions about gender and masculinity. This person is saying, how does Trump's portrayal of strong leadership and assertive masculinity align with cultural norms of masculinity within Latino communities? And how might this influence their voting behavior in the future? This is from an anonymous attendee.
Torn on this one. As the only male on the screen, I guess. So I tend to reject the sort of too easy cultural stereotype machismo explanation, which is applied in different terminology, but for the same logics to African American males as well. I don't actually think that that's what's at work, but I do think that there is a perception of strength versus weakness, or decisiveness versus indecisiveness. And I think people want leadership, and I think men are more likely to attach various esoteric characteristics to whether or not someone's actually a leader. So Biden's soft-spokenness, Biden's apparent indecision, his age, that signaled weakness and indecision, and therefore a lack of leadership. We might all know that whatever his flaws, Joe Biden's a significantly better human being than Donald Trump, but that doesn't mean that the voters did. So I don't like the machismo thing, but I do think that there's a perception of strength and decisiveness that the Democrats don't communicate very well. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess one thing I would add, I'm just curious what people think about this. The other panelists as well, is I always, I agree. I don't like the easy move to like machismo. Like it feels like, because we never talk about that with like all the white voters, like somehow we don't talk about this dynamic of sexism. It's in Black and brown communities, but like white masculinity gets some kind of weird pass on gender in some weird way. I don't know. I feel like there's so many different things going on within communities that it feels like just an easy stereotype to kind of fall to, even as it's an actual cultural thing that is in play at times. It just feels simplistic. But I also do think about things like the manosphere and Andrew Tate and the politics of extreme fighting. And I guess I'm curious, I do think that there's been, Joe Rogan, like all the kind of, there's been a sort of online, I think sometimes there's an assumption that Latino voters listen to like Latino cultural production, and like they do, but there's like a lot of Latinos who are like big into Taylor Swift, or they're into, you know, Worlds of Warcraft or whatever. And so one thing I'm always thinking about is how has the manosphere attracted and pulled in Latinos as a population, because it's been attracting lots of young men, and we're a disproportionately young population. So I'm curious if either of you have any thoughts about like how just the culture of different cultural spaces and podcasts that appeal to men, and like, is that part of the story here? Because it feels like Latino men get drawn into those as well, right? Like any other group of young men.
I don't know. I think I would agree again with Gary. He's so smart and wise that not true. Don't no. I would agree that I think economic issues, that if you are the person that's supposed to support your family and you feel displaced, I think that is a gender issue that did play out. And then certainly young, like we said, younger men, I think that may be part of that. And, you know, Gary, you were talking about, and I agree with you, Christina, 100%, that I think you're right, that Harris, they recognize that later. And I remember talking about government jobs where you don't need a college education. That came up later. Or money to buy your first house. That came up, but too late, I think, in some ways. Or to start a small business. So what is it, like $25,000? So I agree. I absolutely think that these issues came out, but I think maybe a little bit too late.
So this is kind of a fascinating direction for the conversation to have gone, because I think the next question kind of anticipates also the direction the conversation went, but I'll just pose the next question in case there's other aspects to it that that inspire your thoughts. But this attendee asked, how do geographical and generational differences within Latino communities in the US, or the evolving priorities of younger generations, shape their political preferences? And what factors should be considered over the next 4 years to better understand their influence in the next election?
If I may, I will say that SB 314, younger educated Latinos opposed it. And older, I don't want to say older, non-college educated supported it. And I don't know if that's just more nuanced or more thoughtful in terms of what these provisions provide, or, you know, build a wall is a lot easier than let's talk about comprehensive immigration. Let's have a mass deportation, or let's, you know, that's much more politically popular or easier to understand than, I guess, really nuanced. So I would say yes, generation, geographically, like I said, we are predominantly Mexican origin here in Arizona, very different in Florida. Yes, I think these issues in the long run are going to be considerations. But I agree that in many ways, Latinos pretty much were overwhelmingly in support of, I guess, the Democratic ticket. I don't know. What do you think, you guys? What do you both think?
I think one thing that's so interesting is, and that I'm trying to think about, and maybe Gary can speak to this with some of the data he was showing us, which is that I think about region, and I think, you know, we always talk, when you teach Latino politics, you always talk about the fact that we always talk that Latinos tend to be, you know, ethnic, you know, regionally concentrated by groups. So, right, Mexican Americans in the Southwest, you know, Puerto Ricans more in the Northeast, and Chicago, Cubans and Florida, you know, and that is still very, you know, often true, but that these communities are becoming more pan-ethnic in a variety of spaces. And so you think about the fact that so many people after Hurricane Maria moved to Florida, right? Puerto Ricans who moved to Florida, or the kind of the fact that Florida is Cuban dominated, but is also pan Latino. And I guess one question I keep thinking about is that communities and cities and states have political ecosystems, right? They have kind of political cultural ecosystems. Like if you're Latino and you move to Los Angeles, you enter into a political there's a political ecosystem there. There's institutions and organizations that have been longstanding and existed there. If you move to Florida, if you move to Miami, that's a different kind of political ecosystem. So I've been thinking about that because I think I initially thought, oh, when Puerto Ricans move to Florida, they knew they could turn Florida more purple, right? They'll push back as Democrats on the kind of conservatism of Florida. But then I also began thinking, well, they're entering into a political ecosystem. And so that's probably affecting them as well. So I guess I'm curious what we all think about spaces, Chicago, different places where there are these pan-ethnic populations, but do the social political ecosystems of cities or of places, if Latinos are in rural areas, well, that rural areas are more conservative. So if you're in a rural community, will that start to affect the politics of Latinos? I think I used to think of Latinos as kind of moving through time and space and not being as absorbing as much of the political culture of the places they were. And I think I've just become much more aware that we are like everybody. We absorb political culture in the places we live and move. And I'm just curious what people think. And I think Florida is just a really interesting one with the data Gary was showing us.
I don't have a lot to add. I think it was that was really on target.
But were Puerto Ricans, are they becoming more conservative in Florida, or were they still pushing against the politics of Florida, like Florida as a place, or is it both and they're doing both? Or
It's both and. I think on the one hand, the Puerto Rican populations are around Interstate 4 in Orlando are more democratic than you would find in Miami-Dade. And that's true, but they are less democratic than Puerto Ricans in other parts of the country. And part of that, it's actually a twofold process. Part of that is who moved to Orlando after Hurricane Maria, and it tended to be people with more resources rather than less. And so that creates a slightly different dynamic as well. And then, as you pointed out, the ecosystem in Florida is just so weird. That said, I mean, in many ways, the continuity of it all is still pretty resilient, right? Like in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago, you get X. In the Southwest, you get Y. And in Florida, you get Looney Tunes.
Well, it looks like we still have time for another question we have here, but this question is something similar to what you've already answered, but maybe you have a few other thoughts on this. So this anonymous attendee is asking, are there discernible patterns for Latina and Latino voters developing a strong distrust of quote unquote establishment figures that can draw them to figures like Bernie, AOC, or Trump? How can political campaigns or efforts better engage these kinds of voters?
I mean, I'm of the opinion that our politics are pretty broken in a bunch of ways, and that the kind of wealth inequality we have now in this country that rivals the Gilded Age. I mean, we have incredible wealth inequality, and we have and that was something, we had endless wars. There's been a lot of I mean, I remember people saying the Harris Walz campaign was the first time since 1980 that a Biden or a Clinton or I forget, like, or a Bush was not on the presidential election, the names of the people. Like, there's been a Bush, a Biden, or a Clinton on every, presidential election since 1980, right? That sort of the real feelings of kind of the ongoing brokenness of like the same players, the gerontocracy of our politics sometimes. And so Bernie's an interesting figure because we have these older figures who can still come out and speak. But I think one of the things when you think about the Bernie to Trump voter, or AOC looking at voters in New York who voted for her and voted for Trump, is I do think the thing that links them is people who were not necessarily the architects of the dysfunction, who are talking about the deep brokenness of our politics and the need to go beyond the ways we have been conventionally, that getting back to normal doesn't feel like a very good answer to a lot of people, right? And so I do think that naming that, and I think that was an incredibly hard thing for Harris. I mean, I thought she did incredibly well for 103 days or what, 107 days. I mean, But the fact that she was tied to the Biden campaign and she was sort of stuck not being able to celebrate their victories, which were actually many legislatively, but then also not able to kind of craft her own separate road, put her in a really rough bind. But I think needing to name that dysfunction, I think things really do we need to have a real conversation about how to change what's not working. And I think people want that. And until we have that conversation, I think we find ourselves in this kind of stuck place.
And just to add to that, AOC and Bernie Sanders came out in support of Harris and started canvassing her, so that I don't even see them as alternative anymore.
I think the gerontocracy might pass from this world right now. First of all, there's the biological imperative, but then secondly, I think where the Democrats found themselves in this cycle with a president who was clearly too old to run for re-election is something they do not wish to repeat, and would not have happened were it not for the COVID epidemic and the election of 2020, which was a particular form of election. So I think that the age of the old person is going to diminish, even though Congress is obviously still quite elderly compared to the rest of the country. I do think, however, that the issue of brokenness is one that's underplayed, and I think Cristina is really right on target with that. Like, many of us were involved in the immigration rights marches in 2005 and 2006, and it's 18 years later, and there's been no bill passed on anything. And so it doesn't mean that people are voting against the Democrats to punish them, but it means that that's not a credible claim that Democrats can make to try to attract and turn out voters. We've known forever that Latinos are more likely to be independents, particularly when they come to the country as immigrants, because they're not socialized to either political party. And so it's not a big reach to say that they might be really alienated from all of these political organizations.
I think that's consistent here in Maricopa County. We're definitely seeing that. 3 groups.
So we were scheduled to run until the half-hour mark, and my clock shows us kind of right there. So I want to just take this moment to thank our panelists and to thank all of our attendees for joining us for this really important conversation. And have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. It was wonderful. Have a good holiday.
Thank you.